Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luke Harman. I'm the Senior Social Protection Advisor at Save the Children. And also, I have the pleasure of being the chair for this plenary session. So I do very much hope that you enjoyed the parallel sessions. I myself managed to nip in and out of all three. I hope you found the presentation stimulating and interesting discussions as well. And I also hope you felt you made the right choice in going to those sessions that you went to. But if not, fear not, you're in the right place now, because you're going to get the chance to hear a summary of all three sessions. So over the next, probably now 20 or so minutes, we'll be sharing some highlights from those three parallel sessions. First, I'm going to briefly introduce the three chairs and just the broad topics that were discussed. And then the three chairs will go into some more detail on the topics that were discussed. So to my left, we have Joanne Bosworth, who was in the session on financing, social protection. So in that session, I went in and I heard various discussions about, is it even financially affordable universal child grants? Are they possible? I heard some discussions on specific countries where some simulations were carried out, and indeed it was found that yes, it is quite possible. So Joanna will tell us more about that in a second. To my right we have Atif from UNICEF. He's the policy specialist, social inclusion and policy. And the session Atif was chairing was the one here looking at design features. And I came in and heard various interesting discussions there. Again, some micro-simulations about the impacts on poverty. I'm sure Atif will discuss more. And lastly, but not least, Mr. Frota, to our right, who is the social protection specialist from the Decent Work team, Southern and Eastern Africa from ILO. And his session was a very interesting session that I just came from on gender equality and women and girls empowerment. And he will tell us a lot more about the very interesting discussions that took place around how, on the one hand, social cash transfers and child grants may be empowering for women, but on the other hand, we can't forget there are also some potentially unintended consequences. And we heard particularly around the issues of reinforcing gender stereotypes and unpaid care. So I won't carry on myself now. I'll just hand it over, and perhaps we'll start with Joanna to kick us off on the financing session. So Joanna, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we did indeed have a very rich discussion on financing, and we heard first of all from Fabio Duran-Valverde from ILO, and looking at some work that has been done to look at this whole question of affordability and financing, looking at the situation from several middle-income countries and low-income countries. And the conclusion from this, very happily, is that a UCG is perfectly possible. It's definitely affordable. The cost, depending on the country context, ranges from about 1% of GDP to about 3% of GDP. It depends on the country context, how many children you have, and of course the overall fiscal capacity of the country. So that's the first piece of good news, is that it's not that costly. The second piece of good news is that there are lots of options for looking at how to finance universal child grants. And Fabio was encouraging us to consider a wide range of alternatives. There are the more traditional ways of looking at reallocating public expenditures that are currently going towards social protection, moving towards increasing tax revenues, and then looking at things like, shifting the burden more towards contributory schemes so that you free up space for the non-contributory schemes, looking at ODA, managing your debt better, etc. So there are lots of options. And we then heard 3 country examples where people had modeled, simulated the possible ways of financing UCGs. This was from Tunisia, where the potential here for reforming food and energy subsidies has been modelled, and essentially the conclusion from this is that a child allowance programme is possible to finance completely through reallocating the existing expenditures, and that it's much more pro-poor. In fact, if you reallocated all the subsidies to a child grant, you would almost eradicate poverty in that country. And this means it's we're looking at the question of efficiency. Then we also moved to South Africa, where again this was a case of modelling the effect of changes to the tax regime. In fact, both the presentations from South Africa and from Zambia modelled changes to the tax regime. In South Africa, this was a case of looking at direct taxation, personal income tax, and looking at the fiscal requirements to take what is already a very broad coverage child support grant to a universal child grant. I think the interesting thing here is that the additional cost of going from full coverage of the existing targeted grant to a universal child grant doesn't necessarily further reduce poverty, but the question is how you can actually do this. So the question becomes an issue of the relative effectiveness of a targeted program versus just going straight out for a universal grant. And then again in Zambia, this was a case with where a social cash transfer that initially started as a small donor-funded pilot and has now moved to a much broader domestic financing. But here we looked at the question of looking at both the combined effects of taxes and benefits on distribution of income. I think really in terms of the discussion here, though, the key issues that started to come out was, yes, it's all very well to say that it's affordable, it's all very well to say that there are all these different ways of financing, but ultimately it still comes down to being a question of political will. And so in order to generate political will, we have to look at both the questions of the evidence of the effectiveness and the benefits of universal child grants, but we also have to have good, solid evidence around these questions of affordability. So it's a little bit of both is required in order to generate both the understanding among policymakers, but also in order to bring on board the public.
Great, thank you very much, Joanne. Perhaps a small round of applause. That was no mean task, no small task. In some ways, I feel like I've actually got the long straw here. Some people say they draw the short straw. My job is really just to sit in the middle and keep passing over to these excellent chairs. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Atif to summarize from his session.
Thank you so much. There's no way that I would be able to do justice to the 3 presenters, and very rich. And all of them were simulations, and to a point that one participant asked the question that, are you talking about reality or just simulations? So I think the first presentation from the World Bank colleagues, Hugo and EMLA, they looked at UBI. The first thing that actually I learned was looking at how the UBI and the child grant and how they are different. And a UBI is unconditional, it's universal, and it's as a cash component in it, versus a child grant which could be categorical. So there's still a targeting elements there. So UBI is really universal in a sense, and every adult gets some cash benefit. There will be winners and losers in UBI, and if you are targeting in terms of the different age distributions within each age group, there will be winners and losers. So there's no particular age group, either winner or a loser. There were, one scenario which was discussed is if you remove the existing social protection programs and replace that with UBI, it will actually won't have effect on poverty. But if you increase the benefits and generosity of benefits by the poverty gap, then you can see some impact on poverty reduction in the countries that were analyzed. But there are also questions of political, economy related, that if you want to tax the rich, taxing the rich by 10%, and then allocate additional resources to UBI, you can see more impact on poverty. The second presentation was from Martin Evans, our former colleague. He looked at essentially the question was how to design universal child grants, universal in real sense, and also have impact on child poverty. And they looked at child grants targeted at household level, child grants targeted at children, and then child grants targeted at weighted 40%, bottom 40% households at the income distribution. And I think the conclusion there was that Martin, I hope I'm summarizing it correctly, is the weighted average at the bottom 40% has the highest impact in the sense, but also between the household and children, the more impact was found in the targeted at the children. So effective targeting children has higher impact than the households targeted, and the weighted 40%, bottom 40% has much higher impact. And then we also saw an interesting example from Kyrgyzstan, where we went in deeper in the questions around political will, the history of social protection in Kyrgyzstan, the new law which was passed in 2017, some challenges around public opinion about the law, the rights, and the law is actually a lump sum birth allowance paid within 6 months, and adjustments, and some adjustments are proposed to the means tested pensions. With that, I think I'm running out of time, so I'll pass it to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thanks. So the panel presented 3 different presentations, very, very interesting. The first one was by Vijay Lakshmi from the government of Bihar, that presented the experience of the state in different interventions targeting girl children since 2005-2006 that led to the creation of the integrated program Mukhyamantri Kanya Uttan Yojana, that means Chief Minister's Girl Child Upliftment Scheme. It's a conditional cash transfer, universal for program for girls from birth to age 21 years. And that specifically tries to address the disadvantage that girls had in different social outcomes. For example, in terms of female literacy, children stand at 50% against male literacy that was close to 80%. Under 5 mortality for girls stood at 51 against 35 for boys, and also girls' dropout of school outcomes were much worse than boys. So specific programs and learning through experimentation led to this integrated whole-of-government approach in the form of a conditional cash transfer through the life cycle with interventions from early childhood to early adulthood. So the question that came from the audience to this was, what was then the effect on boys? And Lakshmi did indicate that there was, in fact, the original idea was to help redress the disadvantages. There were many programs that address both boys and girls, but some of the elements of the program had to target specifically girls to help redress those disadvantages. Second was a more conceptual approach to explore universal basic income effects on gender equality through three different steps. The first is a discussion on why gender matters in social protection. Secondly, how can social protection be transformative and bring gender equality? And thirdly, by applying an analytical framework for gender analysis on UBI and also child grants. So the question is, how can UBI fulfill its revolutionary promise? It is believed, the authors believe that the UBI is potentially an instrument to revolutionize social welfare arrangements, but not enough attention has been given to the gender aspects and the gender equality outcomes. And the UBI still retains traditional gender framing. So how to maximize the positive effects on gender equality and minimize harmful effects? So they try to analyze, these are still preliminary reflections for an ongoing research agenda. They try to analyze outcomes in terms of access to social protection, gender division of labor in care work, in paid work, and other problems of agency and empowerment. Different analytical frameworks are used, including analyzing the elements of UBI, a triple R framework of recognize, reduce, and redistribute care work, and then some analysis on the gender division of labor and gender equity principles pertaining to anti-poverty, anti-exploitation, equality in income, of time, respect, anti-marginalization, anti-androcentrism. So some of the preliminary conclusions evolve around the problem of the risk of the UBI and child grants perpetuating gender stereotypes, sort of old wines in new bottles. But they recognize that UBI can have potentially positive effects by giving opportunities to reallocate time for leisure and care, for negotiating responsibilities, freeing men from the necessity to work to assure a role of breadwinners and assume more caring responsibilities. But there's also risks of commodifying care work and have social class effects by redistributing the burdens of care for lower earners. But it's not a panacea, and there need to be consideration for how these policies are framed. There need to be complementary services and broader policy frameworks, including parental leaves and so on. The last paper was on looking at the role of conditionalities and how they may be penalizing women and girls through perpetuating gender roles in the context of Universal Child Grant in Argentina. 0 seconds. Just give me 10 seconds to actually speak to the main conclusions that effectively we are seeing that the boys and girls are actually having positive outcomes in terms of attaining better education for those who are benefiting from the program, but there is a lot of exclusion, and conditionalities are actually preventing girls from accessing the benefits in the first place. So the analysis that is done is that domestic care has significant effects on school attendance for girls adolescents, and they are preventing them from accessing the grants. There are systematic blind spots. As a conclusion, there are systematic blind spots in the design of the current Universal Child Grant. Poor mothers have responsibility, and they are seen as policy conducts that they need to subordinate the use of their time to perform the certification of conditions, and so the conditionalities are harming access of women and girl children, adolescents to the program. So the question is UCG all social policy? There is need for more evidence and to look at UCG from a gender lens to take the gender equality into consideration.
Thank you very much. I think a round of applause again for all of our chairs. It was no easy task. There were some very in-depth discussions. I don't want to hold you back from lunch. I just want to take 60 seconds, if I may take the chair's prerogative, to bring things together. I think there are 3 key messages. I think we heard, first of all, I'm glad I did it in this order because it worked out well. It's possible. We heard from the financing team, you know, it's a few % of GDP, and there are many options. We heard from Atif and his session, there are various different ways of designing child grants, and they have different kind of impacts. You know, very good research is going on there. And lastly, we heard that we must also pay attention, however, to potential unintended consequences, and particularly from that session we were hearing about the potential unintended consequences for women and for girls. Understanding the disaggregated impacts for boys, girls, women and men is important, and we need to think more deeply, I think, more discussions around, yes, grants can be empowering for women when they're the recipients, but at the same time, are we reinforcing traditional gender roles? So I think that leaves us with lots of very interesting thoughts to go away with as we go and have some lunch. And before we do, I think we're going actually afterwards into the parallel sessions, aren't we? Another round of parallel sessions after lunch. So I'll hand it over to David.